The reason it's controversial is because he who pays the piper picks the tune. That's what people worry about. Okay? PDUFA revenues, which come from this special earmark tax when a firm submits a new drug application to the FDA, okay, it has to pay a couple $100,000, okay, which is small relative to the other costs, okay, but it's a big part of the FDA's budget. It's about 50% of the Human Drug Review budget. Okay? So people say that because of this, the FDA is biased. Okay? So Richard Horton, editor of the British Medical Journal, The Lancet, says, the FDA, the Centers for Drug Evaluation and Research in particular, has become a servant of industry. And one has to, as a public choice economist, there's some intuition behind this. There's some intuition behind this. Nevertheless, I'm still very much in favor of the FDA for the following sorts of reasons. You have to ask, well, why did FDA approval times increase after PDUFA? And the basic reason is more staff. Okay? Simply put, more staff. So studies have shown that if Congress, okay, had allocated the same budget to the FDA, okay, as was available because of this tax, approval times would have been just as fast. Okay? So it's not the source of the money which has increased approval times, so much as it is simply the fact that the FDA has more resources at its beck and call. Also, even if the FDA became somewhat biased in favor of the people who are now paying their salaries, as I pointed out earlier, there is a big bias at the FDA to be overly risk averse, okay? To worry about type 1 error too much, to have a bias in favor of delaying new drugs rather than approving them. So in my view, this counter bias is not necessarily something to worry about at all, and in fact may be beneficial. There's no evidence that PDUFA increased the proportion of drugs that were later withdrawn. The number did increase, but the proportion, the number of withdrawn drugs increased after PDUFA, but that's because more new drugs were approved. Okay? The proportion of new drugs which were withdrawn didn't change at all, and there's no evidence of that. Notice that this really is a story also about government failure, about the failure of Congress. Congress could have increased the FDA's budget at any time, but they chose not to, despite the big gains to American patients and world patients from faster approval times. Okay? It was Congress's fault. Congress failed. There was PDUFA was a response to that failure. And as such, I think was actually a very good thing, a very good response. So I'm in favor. PDUFA has to be reapproved every 5 years, okay, which has happened twice, okay, since '92. So I'm a supporter of PDUFA. What about a post-market, post-approval drug safety agency, PADSA? Okay, people in the field like these acronyms. I think that's a pretty good idea, too. Improved post-market surveillance is good because more information is better. We have very poor post-market surveillance in the United States. Okay? Once a drug is approved, how well that drug is working is not tracked. It's not tracked very well. We're only beginning to use Medicare databases and databases of large HMOs like Kaiser. Kaiser's been a pioneer in this area, to actually trace how drugs are used and whether they're successful or not once they're actually approved. Okay? So improved post-market surveillance is a good idea, but if we have better post-market surveillance, we ought to, okay, reduce pre-market hurdles. Okay? If we can discover an error more quickly, once the drug has been approved, then that makes sense to approve more new drugs. Okay? If you don't know that there's going to be an error, right? If you don't know, if it's going to take a long time for you to discover an error, then you might want to say, well, since it's going to be difficult to discover an error, we'd better be careful, okay, about allowing a new drug onto the market. The better post-market surveillance we have, then we ought to weaken pre-market hurdles and allow more drugs onto the market. That makes sense because the trade-off gets a lot better the more quickly you can discover a problem. So I'm in favor of post-market surveillance, especially if it allows faster approval times and lower costs to produce new drugs. What about advertising? Traditionally and historically, the FDA has had very strict control over pharmaceutical advertising and promotion. However, in recent years, let me give you an example. This is just great. Again, it's hard to believe this is true, but it is. 1992, Federal Centers for Disease Control recommended that women of childbearing age should have folic acid. They should take more folic acid. Okay? This helps prevent spina bifida. Okay? So CDC said, we recommend that women of childbearing age take folic acid supplements. So Kellogg's and a number of other cereal companies said, hey, this is great. We're going to fortify our cereals, and we're going to advertise that this has got folic acid in it. Right? FDA said, if you do that, we're going to prosecute you. Okay. We are going to prosecute any food or vitamin manufacturer that places the CDC recommendation in its advertising or product labeling. Okay. So here we have a government bureau, the Center for Disease Control, saying, we recommend that women of childbearing age take folic acid supplements. Okay. A bunch of companies wanted to put that, not make up some recommendation, not create some airy-fairy thing out of the sky. Okay? They wanted to say, look, the CDC recommends folic acid supplements. Here they are. FDA said, no way, you do that, you're going to jail. Public didn't learn of the importance of folic acid until Congress passed the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act in 1994. And this really loosened the FDA's vice on the advertising of vitamins and other dietary supplements, created the system we know today. Okay? And ironically, the FDA then made a complete turnabout. And since 1998, the agency has required manufacturers to fortify a variety of grain products with folic acid. So they actually changed the definition of bread so that you have to have folic acid in bread in order to call it bread. Okay? So they went from forbidding to requiring. So that which is not prohibited is mandatory. That's sort of how the FDA sees things. Now, okay. Now, because of the Dietary Supplement Act, and also because in a series of legal cases, beginning with Washington Legal Foundation versus Friedman, the FDA has been really smacked down by the courts. And I say smacked down, the judges in these cases have issued very sharply worded, essentially attacks on the FDA saying, you cannot do this. Okay? Even business firms have some free speech rights. You know, Congress shall pass no law and all that kind of stuff. Okay? First Amendment.